Yeah. Excellent. So I think we're going to get started here, folks. Welcome and thanks for coming to this optional lecture. This is going to be very much a sort of companion piece to the part of the lecture that Marta was giving yesterday. A lot of that was focused on sort of a place-based look at climate vulnerability, and I'm going to sort of turn that and look at it from the opposite side. So a lot of this will seem familiar, but it'll be from a different perspective, looking more from the perspective of wildlife and wildlife effects in climate. And because I like to tell people what I'm going to tell them and then tell them at the end and repeat it over and over again, the main take home from this, if you like zone out and you're eating your food or get distracted, the main take home from my talk today is really that there are a lot of different ways that climate can affect wildlife, and knowing the biology of the species you're working with and the climate effects in the area that you're working are really key to understanding this connection. And once you understand that connection, that gives you a solid basis for choosing management adaptations going forward. So that's the talk right there. My name's Chris Hoving. I am the adaptation specialist for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. And the slides that you see in this talk that are orange colored like this will be my own work. Slides that have these critters on them and have this background are going to be Ben Zuckerberg. So about half of this talk is actually Ben's talk that I'm giving sort of, I won't even say on his behalf. I'm probably going to mangle it, but I'm going to do my best. So overview, what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to start with talking about climate variables and how variable climate change variables really are. Then I'm going to talk about vulnerability and how it varies. So a lot of alliteration going on here, a lot of V's, but the idea is there's a lot of different things, a lot of different ways that these two things can interact. We'll take a deep dive on snowshoe hare and ruffed grouse. So after we talk about it theoretically, we'll focus in on those two species as examples. And then I'll give a little more information on finding species-specific information and some ideas on that. And then I'll open it up to questions. So climate is in the eye of the beholder. Right now I'm reading a really interesting book called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Animals Think? And the whole idea is that animals think in such a different way than we do that it's hard for us to understand how they're thinking. And I think climate is a similar idea. The way that we experience climate as apes that have very little hair, we're really worried about temperature. We're always worried about temperature. It's part of the reason we wear coats in the wintertime or the clothes that we do in the summertime. But other animals are keyed into very different variables in the climate. So for example, a sugar maple is going to be really interested in snow. Snow insulates its roots from the freeze-thaw cycle. And especially during the coldest months, having a good blanket of snow is very important to sugar maples. And then they really need that flush of water in the spring when the snow melts. Those are two key things when they're looking at climate change. They're not as interested in, is it warming, is it cooling? It's the snow aspect of it. Another species that also snow dependent is snowshoe hares, but they don't have roots. They're not really worried about the insulation effects. It's more that they need spring and fall snow when their coat is white, and they need no snow when their coat is brown. They change color to camouflage themselves. And if the climate changes and leaves them brown when it's white or white when it's brown, that's a big problem. And then ruffed grouse is another species that's looking at snow from an insulation standpoint. And so it's actually, a ruffed grouse is similar to a sugar maple in that sense, but they're looking for deep powdery snow. A sugar maple doesn't really care if it's crusty snow on top, it just wants that snow. A ruffed grouse really needs to be able to dive into the snow. They actually roost under the snow, or a lot of the birds do, during the coldest months of the year. And so it's an interesting biological thing, but it also means that they're highly dependent on snow, powdery snow, in fact. So when we look at climate change and how it's supposed to change, this is some work that was done for the Great Lakes area by a colleague of mine, Dr. Michael Notaro. And when you look at how snowfall is going to change in the future, you think, okay, climate change, it's going to warm up, there's going to be less snow. And that is true to some extent. However, let's see if I can bring up. So it's true to some extent. However, if you look at these graphs on the right-hand side here, on the bottom part of the graph is how big a snow event is, you know, a one-day snow event. And then on the y-axis, the vertical axis, is the percent change. So if there's zero change, there's no change in the frequency of those snowfall events in the future. And so you can see there's a negative change. These blue bars show a decrease in the amount of snow for small snow events. But interestingly, when you get out to large snow events, you actually see an increase. So the risk of big snowfalls, of blizzards, increases with climate change, kind of counterintuitive, and the number of small snow events decreases. Overall, average snow decreases, but how it comes and how it manifests is different. And so you can imagine that would be affect different species in different ways. Mean snowfall declines, heavy snowstorms become more frequent. Similarly, how rain and snow interact over the year also changes. And so in this graph, you've got a lot of things going on. Michael's really good at these graphs, have a lot of information. But basically along the bottom, you've got different months. So you've got O for October, N for November. So you've got the winter months, October to May. And then each of the bars is current, the middle bar is mid-century, and the last bar is late century. So this is sort of progression in time. And you can see that overall, for most of these, the amount of precipitation goes up, and the amount of, so the blue bars are snowfall, red bars are rain. And so you can see that the amount of rain goes up, the amount of snowfall goes down. But there's not much change in January, February. There's a lot of change if you look at, say, November or April. And so what this shows us is that in this, you know, in the Great Lakes area, we're looking at still having snowy months, a snowy winter, December, January, February, but we're looking at losing those shoulder months. So for something like a sugar maple, this is probably not that big a deal. There's still going to be a lot of snow during the coldest months, and there's still going to be a flush of snow melt in the spring. If you're looking at something like a ruffed grouse, though, there's a lot of rain that's falling on top of this snow. And so what this graph tells me is there's going to be a lot more crusts. So if you need spring and fall snow, like a snowshoe hare does, this is a big problem. You can get a mismatch going on. You need 2 months of snow, like a sugar maple, this is not a problem. You need powdery snow with no crust, this is a big problem. So you can see that how you measure the change in climate really affects different species in different ways. All three of these species require snow and are sensitive to changes in snow, but the pattern of snow affects them in different ways. So climate effects are species specific. And I wish, you know, I wish it were the simple thing we could say, yeah, all boreal species are vulnerable. All species at the southern edge of their range, they're not a problem. And maybe in the broad sense, that's true. But when you're doing a vulnerability, when you're doing work for specific species, when you're doing wildlife management work, species specific effects matter. And so there are certain tools that have been developed to help people understand these things. And we talked to, Marta talked a little bit about this yesterday. There are tools that look at vulnerability analysis or that focus in on the adaptive capacity part of vulnerability analysis. But the key here is that these tools try to link the mechanism or the trait or some aspect of the species biology or life history to climate change drivers to give managers a sense of what they actually need to do to help that species. And so I'm going to run through some examples of that. This is pulling from a series of papers, and Marta mentioned one of them yesterday, this Thurman et al. 2021. I'm one of the co-authors on this paper, as is Olivia. And Thurman et al. 2020, Olivia's a co-author on that one as well. The early one sort of sets out the framework or the theory of this adaptive capacity look at climate change, species-specific climate change. And then the second paper sort of connects it to management and shows how it's relevant to management. And it's all built around this wheel idea on the right here that looks at different aspects of a species' natural history. So demography, and then specific aspects of demography, lifespan, generation time, age and sexual maturity. All of these different things can either give a species a lot of adaptive capacity to adapt to climate change, or give it a lot of vulnerability, a lot of sensitivity to climate change, depending on the specific variable or life history trait that you're looking at. And when we started looking at this as a group and started like, there were 2 or 3 things that we thought would be important for adaptive capacity. And the more we did literature review and started looking at this, we realized there's, I think there's maybe 30 different life history traits here that are important to different species. And so you can go through and sort of, for a specific species, you can like rank or give a sense of, is it high, medium, or low sensitivity or vulnerability for this particular, for a given trait. Now, I'm not going to recommend that you go through and do a full adaptive capacity sort of thing unless you've got a graduate student that you can give a lot of this work to for each of your species. But the take-home message from this is that there's a lot of different aspects to species biology that interact with climate change and can interact in different ways. So a couple examples. We've got a lot of bird projects, so I wanted to include a bird example here. This is the Ruffed red knot. It's a really cool bird in that it spends part of its life cycle at the southern tip of South America, but it breeds in northern Canada in the Arctic. And so every year it flies literally halfway around the globe. And these are, long-lived species. So they do this multiple times over their life cycle. And that gives it some unique capacity. It can travel to where the climate has changed. That gives it a lot of adaptive capacity in the dispersal category, but it also has these like key places that it needs to find food at certain times during its life cycle as it's migrating across. And so that gives it a key vulnerability. And if you look at the circle, you can see there's a lot of different vulnerabilities. And so you can see this is a fairly climate sensitive species in a bunch of different areas, but there are also areas that give it some adaptive capacity too. And the ones in the blue are more adaptive capacity. The ones in the red are less adaptive capacity. Carner blue butterfly, this is a species that I work with quite a bit. I'm on the recovery team for this species. Was another example that we looked at, and it has a different set of vulnerabilities. So if I go back and forth here, you can see that the red and the blue are in different spots on this species. This is a species that is dispersal limited. It can only fly about a mile, which makes it very difficult for it to track climate change over time. And it has some certain aspects of its life history that are very sensitive to temperature. And then we can look at a herp species, the red-eyed green frog here is another species. Most of the aspects of this species biology give it fairly high adaptive capacity, but there are a couple that are in red where it does have some low adaptive capacity for climate change. And those would give you sort of a sense of where you need to focus on management for that species. And this is sort of our conceptual paper or conceptual diagram on how you would use the adaptive capacity wheel to then start evaluating management approaches. So you could look at, for Carner blue butterfly, for example, is it likely to persist in space? Well, given what the adaptive capacity is for the species, it's unlikely to persist in space. It's also unlikely to be able to shift its range with climate change. And so both of those pathways are really not available to the species. And so then you get a different set of adaptation approaches. Are there ways to enhance its adaptive capacity? Not really, either directly or indirectly. So it really comes down to managing exposure or sensitivity for this species and possibly manage relocation. Number 4 sort of gives you some of the adaptation actions that you could do. But these adaptation actions are things that sort of derive from the biology of the animal itself and the unique degree and types of climate change that this species is exposed to. And that's the sort of the key with this approach to adaptation is it really needs to, you need to have a good sense of what the species biology is of the species before you can start coming up with these management, potential management actions. And again, as was stressed yesterday, for this week, we really just want you to focus not so much on the management actions. Those will be coming next week. It's really focusing in on what climate change are we expecting in the area that where a project is occurring, and what are the specific life history aspects or specific sensitivities. What are the potential adaptive capacity for the species that I'm trying to manage, given how climate is supposed to change around it. So again, we can look at, each of these species have different aspects of their biology that give them different types of adaptive capacity and different vulnerabilities and different potential ways that we could intervene as managers. Now I want to jump, sort of take a deeper dive into 2 particular species that Ben Zuckerberg has done a lot of research on. One is snowshoe hare. So we're going to be looking at extent of occurrence, so some distribution effects on snowshoe hare, and then also its seasonal phenology. So that's down in the bottom part there in the abiotic niche part of it. And then after snowshoe hare, we'll jump into talking about ruffed grouse. And for ruffed grouse, we're going to be talking about demography and how it interacts with this behavioral regulation of physiology. And so those are the spots we'll sort of be taking a deeper dive into. So again, this is the part where I'm talking about Ben's talk. And so I'm going to give a fairly high overview of this, of the research here. If you want to know more about it, I'm going to refer you on to Ben for more of the details. And again, we're just going to be talking about the snowshoe hare and ruffed grouse aspects of it. I would love to talk about Massasaugas as well. I just couldn't get it into the time constraints. So snowshoe hare. Snowshoe hare are a species whose distribution really overlaps the area where we have consistent snow through the winter. And if you look at a map of snowfall for North America, this range map of snowshoe hare is also the area where you get the deepest snowfall across the continent. Obviously, you don't get a lot of snowfall to the south, but as you get up towards northern Alaska and northern Canada, snowfall really drops off because it's a drier climate up there. And this research is going to be focusing in Wisconsin, but obviously it could be the findings applied throughout the snowshoe hare range. So this is a figure showing the shortening of the growing season. So the snow season is changing on average globally by shortening by about 5 days per decade, but it's not even across the globe either. It's decreasing the most in certain areas such as British Columbia, which is the purple spot on the left here, or in the Himalayas, which is the purple spot on the right. And just to orient you a little bit, Wisconsin is going to be somewhere in there in the circle there, so you can sort of see the United States turned sideways. It's look from the pole. When we look overall, put that into numbers, you can see that there's quite a bit of variation in how much frozen ground, how much snowfall we have across the globe from year to year. But overall, there's a pretty clear trend towards a decrease. So Anything that's an above average year is going to be above zero. Anything that's a below average year is going to be below zero. And if you take the area that has changed, it's larger than the state of Texas. So it's not an insignificant amount of area where we've lost this snow cover, about 4 million square kilometers. With this change in snowfall, you get impacts to, especially to species that are adapted to snowfall, be that snowshoe hare, ruffed grouse, or sugar maples, spruce trees, you name it. And so the transition zone between where you have more typically southern species and more northern species is shifting. And so we can see this shift northward from one place to another through time. And that shift can leave some animals high and dry. So you've got, talking specifically about snowshoe hare here. Snowshoe hare have a genotype and a phenotype, and we're going to be talking about phenotype today. So how that genotype is expressed. And there are some snowshoe hare that have that live in areas that have relatively short snow seasons, and they'll stay brown for most of the year. You have other snowshoe hares that live in areas like closer to the Arctic that stay white for a longer period of time. And so there's been genetic selection for the timing of their coats to change, and that's been something that's been relatively stable for the last many thousands of years, since since about 9,000 years ago, when we sort of got into this interglacial period. And so different populations are adapted to the snow seasons that they experience. But if you change that transition zone, you're very rapidly changing the timing of snowfall at a much higher rate than, say, the phenotype changes. And so the research question is, how might this phenotypic mismatch contribute to a range shift? And you can imagine, if you're a predator, this snowshoe hares rely on camouflage. They're white animals in a white landscape, and if you're a white animal in a brown landscape, you're going to be easy pickings for a lot of other critters. There are a lot of different animals that rely on snowshoe hares as their primary food source, including Canada lynx, coyote, owls, and mustelids, weasel family. So if we look at, you can sort of take a retrospective look here at snowshoe hare and look at past studies that sort of gave them looked at their geographic range. Here is one study that was actually done by Aldo Leopold back in 1945. And sort of he drew where the range map for snowshoe hares were in Wisconsin. A similar study was done in 1982, and you can see there's been, in some places the line hasn't shifted much, in other places it has shifted a bit north. And then a more recent study done in 2014 by Sean Salter found that the line had shifted quite a ways further north in Wisconsin. So you've got this progression of sort of a range shift for the species going on, and you can tie that to changes in comparing, historical winter, how much snow there was, how long snow exists on the landscape, with current winters, and you see that the range seems to be shifting with the change in snowfall patterns, especially the loss of snow in the spring and the fall. So then the question is, what could you do about that? Where we can't put snowmaking, I suppose we could put snowmaking equipment out on the landscape, but not at a landscape level to assist snowshoe hares. So what can be done? Well, we can look at how this range has shifted in areas that have a lot of forest cover and have a lot of young forest compared to areas that are relatively open and have less forest cover or have a lot of mature forest. And you can see here on the left that the solid line, areas with high forest cover, tend to be have snowshoe hare longer, even as you decrease the duration of snow cover. So even as snow cover decreases, you tend to lose habitat, more habitat, and lose it faster, this dotted line, in areas with low forest cover compared to high forest cover. So that would suggest that, you know, efforts like planting trees at a landscape level, something you might be doing for, you know, a carbon sequestration, or doing more work to create young forest in these areas where snowshoe hares have a better chance to hide from predators, can have an effect in slowing the range shift, or give these species a little bit of refuge further south than they would be otherwise. So that's a potential management approach. Now, shifting over to ruffed grouse, you can see their range map is very similar to snowshoe hare. Again, a species that is very dependent on snow for part of their life cycle. And that's because snowshoe hare do this really cool thing called snow roosting. So snowshoe hare sometimes will roost on the ground, and you can see, you know, a picture of snowshoe hare habitat there. They're very difficult to see when they're roosting on the ground and something like that. They'll also roost in trees, and they'll roost in the snow. They'll actually fly at high speed into deep, fluffy snow and bury themselves in the snow. And then, you know, snow will fall on top of them, and they'll have often just a little hole here that will allow them to still get air. When they roost in trees, the temperature they're experiencing is about 2 degrees warmer, 2.5 degrees warmer than when they're roosting on the ground. When they're roosting in the snow, it's about 7.5 degrees warmer. So it's considerably warmer under the snow compared to the surrounding landscape. And if you're a species that's living in, you know, the northern United States, or, you know, well up into Canada, sometimes this can be a significant improvement to your experience of your habitat if you can get under that snow. And we can measure this by measuring the stress levels within birds that are roosting in different habitats. And so if we look here at the stress levels of these animals, you can see that the stress levels increase as the temperature decreases. And this would be for animals that are roosting on the ground. Now, if you compare tree roosting to snow roosting, the solid line is the tree roosting. And you can see a similar pattern. The colder it gets, the higher the stress level. Whereas it's pretty much a flat line for birds that are roosting in the snow. They really don't have increased stress levels, even at very, very cold temperatures, because they've got that insulation. And so deep snow reduces the stress level for birds. You can see between, you know, the deeper the snow, the better, down to about it needs to be at least, you know, 10, 15 centimeters in snow depth. So not just a little coating of snow on the ground. You need to have some deep snow. So then Ben and his students looked at how might this climate-induced stress impact a vulnerable species. And what they did was they created some population models, which I won't even pretend to completely understand, but they looked at the variability in how different individuals in a population use snow roosting. Some will go right to snow roosting as soon as there's enough snow. Some are much more reluctant to do snow roosting. And so there's a variability in how individuals use snow on the landscape. Some prefer deep snow, some avoid deep snow. And then you can use that in your population modeling with the effects of stress on the demography, the likelihood that birds will survive or reproduce successfully the next year. And so you can use, like I said, survival probability with snow exposure, how that varies across species. And what you do when you run this through the model, and I think this is really, really interesting, is you can recreate from just the climate effects on the demography of the birds, you can recreate the cycle, the population cycle of ruffed grouse. Ruffed grouse go through about a 10-year cycle where they become very abundant and then not abundant, then abundant. And it's been an ongoing mystery in ecology for over 100 years, what causes cycling in species. And this provides some pretty strong evidence that it is something intrinsic in how the species interacts with snowfall and the climate around it. One of the things that also comes out of this model, and one of the things we also see with this cycling is that the cycling has high amplitude in the northern part of the range. And this is true of ruffed grouse, it's true of snowshoe hare, it's true of Canada lynx, a lot of these boreal species that do this population cycling. The cycle dampens and really stops becoming a cycle at the southern edge of their range. And what they were able to show is that that same pattern occurs in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, with a dampening of the cycle further south. And that dampening is linked to this link between snowfall and the demography of the species. So this is really fascinating. And then they play it forward with climate change and find that the cycles will probably continue in northern Wisconsin until about 2050. And then it'll get too warm and the cycle will start to dampen out. From a wildlife biologist standpoint, you know, the good hunting times when hunters are really enjoying ruffed grouse hunting is when you're in the middle to high parts of these cycles. There's a lot of grumbling at the low parts of the cycles, and not a lot of hunter success. And if you see out here at the far right, 2050, 2060, the cycle dampens, but it also dampens at a low level. And so that's going to be rough on people who hunt snowshoe hares. So I thought that was fascinating. That not only does climate affect how the species demography, but it also affects the cycles and how the cycles play out through time. So between these things, we can sort of get this idea of sensitivity and exposure for these species, for snowshoe hare, ruffed grouse, but really for any of the species that folks are working on in their projects. Combining those two together will give you, vulnerability. You sort of put it through a filter of adaptive capacity. Given its sensitivity and exposure, can the species adapt? And then you start asking this question, why can it adapt or why can't it adapt? And what can we do about that as managers? And so that's really the key to sort of climate adaptation when you're working in really complex systems like ecosystems, with wild species where you don't have a lot of control. You really need to be asking these sort of higher level questions about vulnerability and then adaptive capacity to get at effective management. So take home lessons from this. Climate is complicated. It's much more than just a change in average temperature. We're interested in average temperature because we're hairless apes, but there are many other drivers for other wildlife species. I focused a lot on snow here, in part because that's an interest of mine. It's also an interest of Ben's, but we could be just as easily talking about different hydrologic regimes from flooding or some of the temperature regimes, temperature stress that say fish would be exposed to. And wildlife is also complicated in how they respond to things. It's much more than a poleward distribution shift for entire communities. It's really every species reacting at its own speed in its own way. And then all the species interactions also start to change. One of the good things about this, however, that both are very complicated, is it gives us a lot of different potential effective levers that we can use as managers to intervene for species. It takes a lot of creative thinking sometimes to think of what might be a good management strategy. But again, we don't want you to go there yet. There's sort of a structured way that we want to walk you through that next week. Otherwise, it starts to feel really overwhelming. Today, just focusing in on how's the climate supposed to change where I am, and how might wildlife interact with that climate change. That's the focus. So now I want to go through a couple slides similar to what Marta talked about yesterday on where to look for this information. I've been trying to say over and over again that everything's very species specific. Well, where do you find this species specific information? First place, of course, to go is your syllabus, especially the online electronic version of the syllabus has all of these links. That's a good way to go through it. You also have a lot of it sort of handed to you by the workbook itself. We'll be giving you, at least for the climate stuff, a lot of the climate impacts. Another spot to look, I give you permission to use Google, and especially Google Scholar. It's good to start general. So if I get a call, I get calls from media all the time about different species of climate change. If I get a call about, say, blue-spotted salamanders, I'm going to start with doing a search on just salamander vulnerability, and then maybe go to blue-spotted salamanders. And I might look at, how is the climate going to change in the Midwest, and then focus in on Michigan, maybe even focus in on a sub part of Michigan. So you want to start general, get specific. Field guides are a great place to find things like, especially field guides that have a little bit more description for the species will tell you things like, Blanchard's cricket frogs only have one generation per year, which can be important, or, ruffed grouse are really tied to this snow roosting idea. Management plans and recovery plans are another area. Not that you need to read the whole plan, but just focusing in on that. Usually that introductory chapter has some little nuggets on important life history traits of whatever the species the plan is for. And then the last one, as a sort of a history buff, an excellent place to go is really John James Audubon's books. So everybody knows John James Audubon for his pictures of birds. He was a very good painter. So a picture of passenger pigeons here on the right. But he also was a keen naturalist and interacted with a lot with the scientists and other naturalists around the country. And so his books also have usually a couple page summary. Birds of North America has a couple page summary of the life history characteristics of these animals. Most of it is really quite accurate. There's a couple things you need to take with a grain of salt, but most of it is quite accurate. And similarly, if you're looking at mammals, Quadrupeds of North America, which he wrote with, I forget his first name, Bachman, is another sort of companion to this. It will give you some great natural history information. So I love those old books. Another place to go is the USGS Climate Adaptation Science Centers. This is a plug for the work that Marta and Olivia do. I'm showing you the website for the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, but each of the Climate Adaptation Science Center will have a similar website, and somewhere within that website, they'll list the different research projects that they work on. So for Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, you click on science, it'll give you 164 projects. And then for our work, you narrow it down to fish and wildlife, and boom, there's Ben Zuckerberg and his work on grassland birds. The graphs that I had on snowfall actually came out of this second project here. Project leader Michael Notaro, I was also a PI on that project, looking at winter severity impacts to wildlife in the Great Lakes. And so pretty quickly, there's a pretty good chance, unless you're studying something really obscure, that something at the Climate Adaptation Science Center in your region is probably working on some of those species and get some information. Now, the report may not give you all the information you want, so you may want to actually contact someone. I would suggest starting with these three, just because they're so well connected to the research community nationally. So you've got Olivia, you've got Ben, and you've got Marta, and just picking up the phone. I know they're kind of an old-fashioned thing, talking on the phone rather than typing on the phone, and especially if you find one. My parents still have one of these phones. It looks actually just like this one, where you have to stick your finger in and then pull it to the right and then lift it out. Really weird technology, but it works, at least for making phone calls in one direction. So with that, I can sort of open it up to questions.
We have one comment in the chat box that I think you just made everybody's head spin. It can feel a little overwhelming where to begin. And so I would recommend that first you log into your adaptation workbook and see what information is automatically populated for you based on where you put your pin and what habitat types you selected. And then think about what additional information you're looking for. And rather than see this as a comprehensive list that you need to work through, look for those best opportunities to fill the gaps for your particular place on the landscape and your particular goals and objectives. Chris, do you have any other tips for making this a little more straightforward and less bonkers?
Yes. So it was somewhat by design that I had it be a little bit overwhelming here, because one of the things I wanted to get across was that there are a lot of different climate variables and a lot of different ways that species can be vulnerable, which can feel very overwhelming. However, the flip side of that, which I probably didn't stress enough with the resources, is that getting a sense of the biology of the species you're working on is actually relatively easy. If you can find a children's book on snowshoe hares, it's probably going to talk about their pelt change, how they change color. A lot of field guides are going to go over that sort of thing. So, the sort of thing that you find in a 2 to 3 page summary on a species is really probably going to get at the depths that you're going to need to start drawing those connections to climate. Nobody expects you to do a dissertation on a specific species and its climate vulnerabilities. I guess that's the other sort of set of resources that are out there. A lot of people have already done the dissertation, and so you just need to read the abstract and find out that oh yeah, someone did a whole study on snowshoe hares in Wisconsin and found that voila, you plant trees and you have more early successional things, and it helps with the snowshoe hares. So you don't really need to do the research yourself, which obviously would be very overwhelming, but finding the sort of the cheats or the easy way out is finding those really short descriptions of the biology of the species, its life history, and then finding out if someone's already done the research. So you can just read the abstract or the end of the paper. I don't think I can see the chat. It's disappeared on me again. Were there any other questions, Patricia?
No, Marta put a link to the Midwest cask projects that folks can look at in the chat box. And I don't know, there were a couple more specific questions about ruffed grouse, and so I can let folks chime in if they still want to talk about that. Otherwise, if folks just want to unmute and ask any questions that are on your mind, now is a great time.
Yeah, one thing I will throw in there while I'm thinking of it is that until a couple of years ago, the Midwest was included under the Northeast cask. And so if you're in the Midwest looking for past research that was done, look at the Northeast cask website. It'll have that work.
Thanks. And then Sharon's question about ruffed grouse was, ruffed grouse exists in southern Appalachians. Oh, my chat just disappeared. Let me scroll back to it, where there is little snow. So do you think snowfall is only necessary for winter survival when the mean winter temperature is below a certain number? And then Caitlin offered a response that she thinks they start relying more heavily on conifer cover for roosting when they don't have enough snow. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that or if you need any clarification.
Yeah, I think that when you get to the areas that have less snow, you'll still have, ruffed grouse will still be using some of those areas. And obviously they won't need to, if it's warmer, they won't need to roost in the snow, but they're also not going to get the cycle effect. So depending on what your goals are for the species, if you're looking to just have snowshoe hare on the landscape, snow may not be as big a deal. If you're looking for a huntable population, or let me even rephrase that. If your hunters are used to the cycle, they'll expect the cycle to continue. So a change in the cycle dynamics is going to be a big change for those hunters. If they've been living, in the southern Appalachians, if they've been living without a really pronounced cycle in snowshoe hare numbers for a long time, it's probably not going to affect them as much.
I guess to follow up with that, so I'm in New Jersey, and we don't always get a lot of snow, especially powder like snow. We get a lot of ice snow.
Right. Yep.
So our grouse probably are used to roosting in more coniferous cover than snow roosting. But our temperatures don't really get very cold. It's very, we get down to maybe 20 degrees Fahrenheit in the teens sometimes, but that's it. That said, if they do rely more on coniferous cover, we have a lot of hemlock dying now. And our grouse population is very, very, very low. They've closed the season. They would be listed as state threatened if they were a non-game species. So I'm just thinking about how, what would be a good surrogate for hemlock for grouse.
Yeah, and that's exactly the sort of thinking. You're starting to think about the stress caused by temperatures. How they regulate that is, if they don't have good snow, is going to be the conifer component.
Was diseases and health somewhere in the traits wheel? I don't remember seeing it. We saw it real quickly because I was wondering about ruffed grouse and West Nile.
Yeah, I think it's under species interactions is where the disease threats come in, but that's definitely something to keep in mind. There are a lot of different diseases that have a climate component to them. And if you stretch the idea of diseases to like pests and invasive species, then it becomes an even bigger thing. For example, out west, there's a beetle called the mountain pine beetle that will go through one population a year, and it'll impact trees, it'll kill weak trees, but it's not a forest changing type thing. But with climate change, it was allowed to go to 2 populations per year, which allowed the populations to get so large that it would kill all the trees over, tens of kilometers, and eventually over entire landscapes. So it's been a big deal, and that was really just triggered by an insect that could go through a second generation a year.
Thank you.
one interesting thing we found with a disease here in Michigan, there's a disease that affects deer mostly in the southern United States. The common name is blue tongue. Technical name is epizootic hemorrhagic disease. But it's something that deer in the southern United States have antibodies for. And so it will affect individual deer, but not have a big population effect. But with warming temperatures, the vector for that disease, which is a midge, a little like mosquito-like bug, was able to come into Michigan, where deer didn't have the autoimmune response to that disease, and it caused some not widespread die-offs, but some very intense die-offs in certain areas within the state. So even the same disease can have different dynamics if it's moving into a naive population, because climate is allowing the disease to spread. All right, again, apologies if I made it seem overwhelming. I wanted to make it seem, wanted to make you know that it was complicated, but that also gives you, it also gives you a lot of options. And I think the places to find the information are actually it's relatively easy to, if not find the information, to digest the information. You're just looking for abstracts and short descriptions of life history.
I appreciate like the overview and where to find the sources. In my experience, a lot of people are latching onto climate change as a reason to not manage forests. And they're using, for example, golden winged warbler is one of our poster childs for young forest management. And the argument is, well, we're losing them to climate change anyway. They're all moving north. So why bother? And
Yep.
so it'd be good to be able to look into the research and say, well, no, based on the climate change bird atlas, they're going to be moving east because they can't go in the boreal forest. So all the upper Midwest birds are going to be moving to Jersey if we have habitat for them. So I think that's great to kind of be able to have that information and have that answer really ready.
Yeah, definitely. Caitlin?
I just wanted to add, I was the one that made the comment about, I was kind of joking when I said like starts to get overwhelming, because I mean, I didn't find that you made it overwhelming. It's been overwhelming. Like it's something that, I spent a lot of time thinking about, and when you try to bite it all off at once, it's a very overwhelming thing. Like, with everything needing to be species specific and with vulnerabilities varying by, where you're at in the state, the country, like, it's kind of that big question of where to start. So, I mean, it has already been overwhelming. And I think, I'm realizing more and more how appreciative of this workshop I will be, because for me, it's, you guys are doing a really great job of presenting it in like bite-sized pieces and just really focusing on one step at a time and not getting ahead of ourselves. So, and this was, I think, a really great talk. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I don't want to steal Stephen's thunder here, but that's really what the whole workbook is supposed to be doing, is taking something that is climate change is overwhelming. And it's not something that most of us have been trained in, and gives you bite-sized pieces. You can do this step and then do this step and then do this step. And that makes it a little less overwhelming. It's still overwhelming, but it's a little less so. I also like to point out to people that biologists today have the benefit of 100 years of research into the relationships between wildlife and vegetation. 100 years ago, they really didn't have that level of information that we have now for different species and what we call their habitat. We're just now starting, maybe 10 years ago, to develop the relationship between species and climate. And it'll probably be another 100 years before we have really good information to, give managers on what really are the species specific climate, impacts. But we have information that we can go on. We have a start on it, but we're really sort of at that first principles level of, okay, what's the life history of the species? How's the climate going to change? And what's the best guess that I have on what these relationships are and what we can do about it. So I give you permission to live with the uncertainty, embrace the uncertainty. There's no teacher out there that knows the right answer and is gonna say, hey, C+. All right, well, if there aren't any other questions, I think we can give you back 5 minutes of your day, give you a chance to grab a bite or do some other biological needs before going to your next meeting.
Thanks, Chris, and everyone else.
Yep, thank you.
Chris.
Thank you.